So I just want to welcome everyone to the Writers Center. My name is Zach Powers. I am the artistic director at the Writers Center, and I'm a fiction writer and a novelist. So I hope all you poets please forgive me for being here as a horrible imposter amongst the poetry crowd. I'm an avid poetry reader though, and I do work with Poet Lore, which is a publication published by the Writers Center, and a little more about that in a moment. I do see a lot of new faces and a lot of new names. Oh, good, another fiction writer. Good. I'm not alone. I'm not alone today. So I see a lot of new names and new faces, which means I can introduce the Writers Center to people who maybe don't know it as well. And that always excites me a lot because the Writers Center is a really, really amazing place. And we are a nonprofit that exists to support writers and everyone who wants to write. We do that in a lot of different ways. One of the main things we do is we offer between 250 and 300 creative writing workshops every year. Those are in all genres and for all experience levels. So if you are a writer, if you're an aspiring writer, if you have a project you're working on or a project you think you might want to start, you can go to our website, writer.org, and check out our upcoming workshop listings and see if something sounds interesting to you. I'm going to put a couple links into the chat window after I am done talking, because I don't think I can do both at the same time, but I'll put links to some of the things I'm talking about in there as well. In addition to our workshops, which I will just right away say they cost money, we do dozens of free events though too, because we want to be able to make sure that our offerings are available to everyone. And we also offer scholarships to our workshops, most of our workshops as well. But for our free events, you're at one of them right now, so you're already sort of familiar with the free events offered by the Writers Center. But if you go back to our website, writer.org, and go to the free events tab, you can see some more things that are coming up, both in person for those of you nearby and online like this. We have a virtual craft chat series where we talk with authors from all around the world about usually new books they've just published. And we always talk with a little bit more about the craft of writing, because again, we're sort of focused on helping out writers as opposed to general readers. So if you want to see some of our past programming, you can also go to our website where we have recordings of almost every event we do. And that's an amazing resource. We've talked to amazing authors. We've had amazing conversations about writing, as well as readings and discussions and other things like that. So anyway, just a great resource if you're interested in writing at all. So please check that out. And again, I'll put the links up in just a second. And the last thing I want to mention, very importantly for this event, and I mentioned it briefly earlier, is that the Writers Center publishes Poet Lore. Poet Lore is America's oldest continuously published poetry magazine. It's been publishing we just had its 134th birthday party last month. So 134 years, and it continues to publish the best in contemporary poetry. So if you are a poet, if you want to check it out, I think we just closed for general submissions, but we'll be opening soon for themed submissions for our next guest editor. I can't remember what the theme is because I'm not very good at my job, but hopefully you'll go to the website, which I'll put the link into, poetlore.com, and you can see what that theme submission is, and also just check out the publication. It's really, really incredible. It's a beautiful book in a really nice, it's in 8.5 by 11 format, so it's really big. We have some poems that don't fit in normal journals and some 2 poems on 1 page. It's a really beautifully curated magazine. So you can check that out as well. I think that's enough about the Writers Center. So let us go to the event proper. And let me pull up my notes for the event proper. So we're here today for a virtual reading with poets Jodie Hollander and Christina Pugh. And just real quickly, I'm going to do maybe not the full bio, but a quick rundown of our 2 guests so they can take over and begin with the fun part of the event. Jodie Hollander's work has appeared in journals such as Poetry Review, Yale Review, Harvard Review, and several others. Her full-length debut collection, My Dark Horses, was published with Liverpool University Press and Oxford University Press. Her second collection, which we are here celebrating today, Nocturne, is now out and available. Hollander's been a recipient of a MacDowell Fellowship and a Fulbright Fellowship in South Africa. She is also the originator of Poetry in the Parks in conjunction with several national parks and monuments in the US. She currently lives and is zooming in from now, Flagstaff, Arizona. Christina Pugh has published 5 books of poems, including Stardust Media, the main book we're here to celebrate today, and then which won the Juniper Prize for Poetry, as well as Perception, and several others. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic, Poetry, Kenyon Review, Yale Review, and many others, and has another book of poetry, The Right Hand, forthcoming in 2024 from the amazing Tupelo Press. There's a few more things. I'm going to stop it there, though, and hand off to Jodie and Christina. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm really, really excited hear the works today. And I will just mention that Christina is logging in under Rick, so that's showing a point. Make sure we this is not some random person coming up. That is Christina in that window there. So both of you, please take it away, and thanks so much for joining us.
Okay, well, should I read first? Should I get started here?
Yeah, that would be great if you can.
Okay. Absolutely. Well, thank you guys all for coming. It's an honor to be here. And first of all, thank you to my friends who are in the Zoom audience. It's so nice to see you guys. It means a lot to me. Thank you. Thank you to the Writers Center for hosting, and Zach in particular. And Christina is, not only is she an exceptional poet, but she's also a dear friend that I've known for quite some time. So it's truly an honor to read with her. So Christina, thank you for being here as well. I'll be reading for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then Christina will read and we'll answer questions at the end if anyone has any. So this is my second collection, Nocturne, which has recently come out with Liverpool and Oxford University Press. And in my first collection, My Dark Horses, I focus primarily on poems that deal with my relationship with my mother, who was a classical cellist. But in this collection, I focus more on my relationship with my father, who was a classical pianist. However, I also look at dream poems, which seem to sort of frame the collection and investigate the role of nature as a refuge as well. So I'll start off with the first dream poem in this collection. It's called Dream Number One. And dream number one is Liebestraum, which means love dream. The grand piano that fell from the sky did not make a sound as it crushed me, nor did I make a peep lying pinned under the weight of that beast. I felt a cold pedal in my stomach, a wooden leg stuck inside my back, metal strings pressing on my lungs. Around me were tuning pins, damaged hammers, broken keys. I lay very still, not feeling any pain, wondering if perhaps I'd already died. A medic arrives, says, "Blink twice if you're alive." I blink twice, and she slides a stretcher under me and the piano. It takes 8 people to lift us up. The ER expands its doors to fit us through. A surgeon examines us and says, "Clearly, this piano must be removed." And I weep, recalling lying beneath it as a girl, listening to it practice Liebestraum over and over again. Yet even then, I somehow knew it only loved the sound of its own music. A medic wheels us into surgery, and I ask what will happen to the piano. "Too late, it's beyond repair," he says, inserting the needle and drug in my arm. I wake to beeping, the doctor's saying, "You're lucky not to be paralyzed." But I don't thank the doctors for their work, nor do I count my blessings I'm alive. Instead, I grow enraged. I start to scream, "Why the hell did this piano fall on me?" And when no one answers, I just laugh. And looking up, I ask, what else will crash down on me from God's big attic? For a while, the working title of this collection was God's Big Attic, but I changed it to Nocturne because I wasn't sure about having the word God in the title of my collection. So as I mentioned before, my father's a classical pianist, and I spent quite a bit of time as a child lying underneath my father's piano and watching him play. Here is Hands. After all, these were good hands, hands that could play Beethoven, Bach, Brahms, or Debussy, Even Rachmaninoff was easy for his hands. Some said he had genius hands, like the hands of Helfgott or Horwitz. Others loved his ragtime hands that made him rise from the bench, coattails flying as he wildly played. Somehow his hands had a way of making a room full of people stop talking, listen, and even weep. But these were not the hands we saw at home. At home, his hands were red and dry, his bony fingers cracked and bled and had to be wrapped in bandages. And at home, his hands were always practicing, arching, crackling like strange crustaceans, then scuttling up and down the piano keys. Perhaps then they were happy. But otherwise, his hands stayed hidden in the dark pockets of his slacks, avoiding his wife's hands, the hands of his own kids, and seeming only to ache for the applause of strangers' hands. This is another childhood memory poem. The potato plants. She kept the potatoes beneath the kitchen sink in a dank place I never dared to enter. But at fall planting time, Mother always sent me down into that moldy smelling cupboard where the potatoes looked soft, even shriveled. Some had grown white shoots in the darkness. I'd rip open the netting, feeling the dirt on my hands as I gathered potatoes in a bowl, then met my mother out in the back garden. There, I'd find her shadow moving quickly, raking the plot and using her strong hands to make rows and rows of divots in the earth. My small hands copied my mother's hands, as one by one we buried potatoes together, while Mother confessed to me about her affair. If only he would leave that wife, she'd chuckle. Then as the sun set over our backyard, she paused, turned to me and asked, "Don't you think I ought to leave your father?" I thought of Mother's question without a clue, that years later I'd find it impossible to sleep, or that our plants might one day sprout long legs and march crooked into my dreams at night. Father's piano thundered from the living room as I whispered to my mother, "Yes, leave him." Then we covered up the plot with layers of hay, and in the darkness turned on all the sprinklers. You'll get to meet my entire family in this reading today. So you've met my mother, you've met my father, and you're going to meet my brother in this next poem. So this one's called Mother's Parrots. Once my younger brother blackened every parrot on Mother's favorite couch, then signed my name to his work. When Father walked in, Brother rushed to the door. "Look at what she's done." Father began to pace, sweat, and clutch his forehead. When Mother returned home, she summoned me and my brother, handed us buckets and rags. "Neither of you will leave until this couch is perfect. And if you don't stop fighting," she added, glaring hard, "I will leave for good, and you won't have a mother." All that night we scrubbed and scrubbed Mother's parrots while listening to our mother scream upstairs at Father. Then Mother's car roared off and Brother ran out after. He stayed outside a while, then appeared in my doorway, holding a baseball bat. I wish that you would die, he said, smashing my mirror, then went to the basement where Father was practicing. Excuse me for interrupting, but I finished the parrots. Good, Father said, still playing, humming and closing his eyes. Come, see what I've done, Brother said, tapping Father. Later, Father nodded, still humming Debussy, and leaning back in the bench, not seeing the colorful birds now gathering by the hundreds and flying all over the house. My first collection of poems was called My Dark Horses, and for some reason I find myself writing obsessively about horses. At least I did in that first collection. And so I sort of made a deliberate attempt not to write too much about horses in the second book, just so that I could try and distinguish it as different from the first. But there are a couple of horse poems that found their way in. So I'll read now Her Singing Horses. My big sister's horses are mostly dead horses. Once her horses were talented horses. Once her horses were singing horses. Once people said my big sister's horses had the most gorgeous young voices they'd heard. Everyone said she had show-stopping horses. Everyone said her horses were stars. Everyone said they'd be headliner horses and VIP horses, celebrity horses, the next it horses to sing in New York. But somehow my big sister's horses got sick, and somehow her horses got so fucked up they couldn't sing. They tried and tried to sing, but all that came out was a gravelly sound. No one knew what was wrong with her horses. Even the experts were stumped by her horses. Something must have happened to those horses, something her horses stayed silent about. People gave up on trying to help, and soon no one seemed to care anymore. No one invited her horses to sing. No one wanted to see them perform. People just whispered, her horses are sick. Some even turned on my big sister's horses, saying her horses were nothing but horse shit and demanding a refund on all their support. Most of her horses died out of sadness, and those that remained were sunken and thin. Some of her horses slept all day long, and some of them tried to be regular horses, but found it meaningless, depressing, absurd. And all of her horses got anxious at bedtime, and all of them took those horse sleeping pills, but that didn't help with the horrible nightmares. It just made her horses distracted, forgetful, and made them into those kinds of horses. Horses that mutter strange things to themselves. Horses young horses are told to avoid by averting their eyes and crossing the street, and horses some of the neighbors now knew as horses that wake in the night now and scream. Well, I hope these poems aren't depressing you too much, but I want to move now to maybe some nature poems that I think really sort of offer a break from the intensity of the first half of the collection. So I'll read Glacier Lilies. I've heard they're everywhere in Montana, up in the mountains during the month of May, blooming through the wide open meadows, or spreading across an entire forest floor. For the animals, these flowers are like manna. After a long winter of nearly starving, black bears, mule deer, and bumblebees appear, feast on their bright yellow petals, nourish on their rich inner bulbs. Although I have never seen these flowers, I've been reading about them now for years. Many times I've thought, I'll put on boots and hike high up into the mountains, beyond where there are any marked trails. I'll likely have to pass through mud and ice, not to mention the wind this time of year. And what if I never find a glacier lily? The truth is, my winter has been long, and down where I live, there are no flowers. And yet I often think of them surviving, with long, elegant stems and delicate heads. What if I hiked up there and I found one, declaring itself in bold yellow petals and blooming on the edge of vanishing snow? I'd like to read a couple poems now that are set in Key West. And Key West is quite a special place for me. I was a poet in residence there on 2 different occasions, but both times I went, the weather was pretty wild. There were these incredible storms, particularly on the first occasion, and flooding, and trees down and coconuts rolling all over the place. And everyone was apologizing to me because at that point I lived in Colorado and people felt so badly that I'd come to Key West and I had this horrible weather. But I kept thinking how wonderful it was for poetry. So this one is called Storm. Though the green coconuts seem safe in the trees, as winds pick up, I wonder, perhaps something is coming once again. Out on my deck, I'm still, just witnessing as the sweet smell of plumeria flowers quickly shifts to the dark smell of rain. An anxious rooster hurries to shelter. The palms flap their monstrous fronds, and suddenly I'm afraid. Moving indoors, I watch the wind get wild and tip over a pink bike and knock down a chair. Then the rain arrives, hard, deliberate, driving itself straight into the ground. I cower alone in the house. Ugh, not again. Now the outdoor couch cushions are sailing, and a tree is yanked up, exposing its roots. I feel my small self lifting from the ground, but this time I don't resist. I let myself go to wherever it is I go in these storms, often not to return for months on end, knowing I'll come back to comb these streets for every single last fallen coconut. I'll wrap them in blankets, take them home, and nourish myself on their bitter milk. One of the really cool things about the residency that I had in Key West was that in the backyard was this incredible mango tree, and people would scale the fence by night to steal the mangoes because they were supposedly like the best mangoes on the island. And then oftentimes people would come to the door and say, "Oh yes, I'm friends with the people that own this residency. May I have some of your mangoes?" So they were super popular mangoes, and I happened to be there right, when these mangoes were falling, and they were totally delicious. And so I'd often sit right by that tree, and that was sort of the inspiration for this poem, Evening on the Porch. The rocking chair is rocking, though no one sits in it on this windless evening. And yet this rocking, back and forth as if a soul could somehow wish to be here once again on long, warm evenings with a tall glass of whiskey, reading and dozing off, or gazing longingly at the orange-pink sunset vanishing behind the trees, the last ripe mango dropping into darkness. Would they, if they could, return to this ruined porch just for one last look at evening in Key West? And I'm just going to finish on 2 more poems, and then I'm going to turn it over to Christina. This poem comes from last year, when I had learned that my father had had a stroke, and I hadn't seen him for quite some time. So I traveled back to Milwaukee to connect with him. It's called After the Stroke. When the nurse first wheeled him out, I hardly recognized his skinny arms, his bony legs folded to the side, the way his mouth drooped on the left. He was dressed in pressed black slacks, a blue sweater too big for his shoulders. He looked up at me from his wheelchair and said in a weak voice, "Good to see you." And I burst into tears. This was my father whom I hadn't seen in decades, the father everyone said I was lucky to have, to grow up around all of that classical music. I watched him struggle with his fork, unable to move spaghetti to his mouth. What was there to say? What was there to say after all these years? But good to see you too. I helped him move the orange juice to his mouth, his hands covered in brown spots, shaking as they tried to hold the glass. Together, we rested the glass on the table. Then I put his hands inside of mine. I held on to my father for a moment and watched the orange juice drip from his lips. So I'll just finish on one final poem. It's about horses, and it's set in Australia. And it's also one of the last poems that my poetry mentor helped me to edit. I had been studying with him since I was 16 years old, and he taught me to write in meter and form. And he was a very special friend to me, and very influential to my writing. And he passed away in 2020. And he liked this poem a lot. This one's called Two Horses. There is no happiness like the happiness of horses. Just look at these two beauties moving through the landscape. Who has sent them to us, and from what other world? Today I'm watching them meandering together beside the acacia trees. As they pause to eat grass, I see their long tails swaying in the sunlight, and I wonder what they know of life that I don't know. I've seen them stand for hours. It doesn't really matter whether the rains are coming or if that familiar darkness will soon be on its way. Seeing them here today under this vast Australian sky, it finally dawns upon me. My life is more than enough. To be alive is a blessing. Thank you very much.
All right. That was such a wonderful reading, and I just love Nocturne. I love Jodie's book, and just wanted to thank Jodie for asking me to read here with her, and thank Zach. And thanks to all of you for coming. It's wonderful to see everyone here to listen to some poetry. I'm going to be reading from this book, Stardust Media, which came out in 2020, so a few years ago now. And there's a lot of different media in this book. It can be anything from our contemporary electronic media to painting to, Greek urns, sort of any kind of made thing. And I'm going to begin with a poem called Heads Up. Try to resist the wetly obvious, to love the suffix even more than the word it ends. The recessed zipper, not the color of the coat itself. Some might call these things a supplement to what we think we're knowing, like watching a dancer when she rests after dancing, her surfaces drinking up an image of branches projected on the front wall, her speaking hands a canvas. The tree's less an image than a place marker, really. It's a screensaver, figures we might not forget before the real work starts. The tree's lost its leaves, but is fingering the sunlight. The branches and sky now star the dancer's arms and are staining her forehead as she wrinkles it to speak. So light inflects her skin, culling a strand of a scene she isn't watching. This beauty, what we used to call a breather. The next poem I'm going to read is called Like Truffles, Like Channel Surfing. And it's interesting because a number of poems in this book were written over a course of a few weeks in which I first met Jodie. It was at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts that we were almost roommates there. We had a connecting rooms, and there was someone there who was an environmental artist. His name was Cameron. And he said to me at one point, he said, "Your poems are like truffles, or else they're like channel surfing." Unfortunately, we lost this artist way too young. But that became the jumping off poem for this poem, Like Truffles, Like Channel Surfing. I love a word that melts in the mouth of my language, like truffaut, or better, tartufo in Italian. I love lying back as the opening credits are slowly chased into the distance by faces. I love the promiscuity of television. Its screen, I mean, since it flickers to anyone. I love climatology more than the plot. I love the bluebells on Broadchurch, the ones I misidentified as Lupin. I loved the surveillance monitors on Homeland. I love a refulgent Cornell box with an owl, a Pavlov, a tutu, a telescope. How I love a magpie. I love a box whose EKG is Blu-ray. I love that remote control is affordable. I love the nuns on the 300th channel in their midnight campfire of Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for our sins now and at the hour of our death, amen. The sweetest drag of a Danjou pear skin, the truffles, salt, or it's 80% dark. I love my life in a nautilus shell. So I talked about media and how this poem encompasses all kinds of different media. And this one happens to be graffiti. It's Italian graffiti. So if you've been to Italy, you know there's a lot of, in the cities, there's a lot of graffiti, probably a lot more than here. And this poem is actually begun with a phrase from Hamlet, when Hamlet's looking into the clouds and describing them. So this poem is called Scribble. Backed like a whale is what I might say, since Italian graffiti always smears with a trace of the mammalian. Nothing backhanded there, nothing written anywhere without marrow backing it, a scaffolding that reaches out far behind the Renaissance and back to lapis lazuli illuminated capitals, prehensile as the curled hand depicted on a neighbor's frieze. I've recently noticed that the oil from my fingertips condenses to an oval near the center of my laptop mouse. The stain is only visible in lamplight. I don't make much impression on electronic media, though some of them are smart enough to read my very retinas just to make sure I'm me. I have no seal, it seems, and no familial mark, unless you count the illegible monogrammed P embroidered black on a black bathrobe my sister once gave me. But outside, eye bright echoing on letters, a treble clef curls into sex pink anatomy, morto ma vivo son supporto magnetico. And suddenly from the train, magnetism stirs your veins, or skyish ellipsis, like a shimmering, I saw the sun scribbling away, shivering our curtains in the February afternoon. All right, so on to more media. This next poem is called Hot or Cool Media. And I saw Catherine McCarthy join the Zoom call. I'm not sure if you're still there, Catherine, but if you are, you will recognize certain things in this poem. Catherine is an incredible visual artist and a friend. And the poem is really talking about the differences in temperature between and among different media. So the idea that some media surfaces seem cooler than others. So this is called Hot or Cool Media. I would vote for cool in the case of the color TV my father built in 1970. With a white silver knob, you needed all 5 of your fingers to pull, its edges as serrated as a new quarter corn-fed. You'd have to plan your viewing at least 5 minutes in advance so the picture could warm up, from gray Zen stone to pathless stripes of Via Lactae to the dresses and slacks and polyester faces of persons finely wired for sound somewhere within those cathodes. In an interview once, I recall my artist friend seemed to speak of media as weather, said painting was warm, not cool like video, a word not yet invented, I gather, the nights I sat too close to the screen, hoping the Milky Way cohered in time for the theme song set to tinkle reliably at 8. She also named a painting Touching Everything for Alan, which co-stars a square rumple of red satin sheets, then corners of some satin blue, 2 zooms, 1 room, 2 saturated hues. Yes, I can touch what she makes me see. And just when it tells me it's fever, I'll realize she's right, that now I have no business with chiasmus, that I won't exchange the one term for the other, as happens far too often in the hopscotch of the sonnet. The TV's cool, even white hot plasma, and when dust swirls on this laptop screen, I'll need a constellation map, preferably with holes, if I still want to read. So thinking about Gordon Lightfoot for a minute. So some people may know, yeah, we just lost Gordon Lightfoot, the Canadian folk singer. And Gordon Lightfoot makes an appearance in this poem. And not only Gordon Lightfoot is here, but Robert Frost as well. And his poem called Design. And the ending of that poem goes, what if not design of darkness to appall, if design govern in a thing so small. And so these things are together. The other thing I should say about this poem is that the title of the poem is I Don't Know How to Make a Website. And the poem is kind of playing with the idea of website SITE versus website SIGHT, which might have been what somebody would have thought someone was saying before the word website SITE became part of common parlance. So that kind of homonym thing going on. I don't know how to make a website. Even though I'm not that old, you might call me ancient, but I still feel rather fly by night. I used to slip notes under doors and scrawl my number in thick magic marker. If you'd asked me then about a website, I might have echoed, website? IGHT? And tried to explain how the cobwebs in the boxwood fogged dim shapes in the photograph I'd snapped with my Instamatic camera. That was a lawn in which no leaf vein was left to chance, but I'd zoomed in on the exiguous pre-lettering that sifted in the hedges to form points on a hypotenuse I saw connect the bush and a filigreed porch column. The webs razzle-dazzled me. My dad said they were crappy. That's a schism that persists today, when a lone cobweb in a spotless condo is apt to furrow my brow. Can this be secret code or tiniest ecology? Missed a spot knocking on Buddha's door? And if around design, that white heel-all keeps haloing the website, it's hard to tell if it matters or just clutters. But shoe fly ambivalence became the slope and snarl of my life, though I couldn't have foreseen it then, not when the angel Gordon Lightfoot sang cobwebs and dust, with which he rhymed, I hate to leave you, but leave you I must. I still think Gordon knew a thing or two about refrain. Okay, I'm getting to another poem now called The Social Fabric. And I know there are a couple people here. Oh, I see. Yeah, there are a few people here from UIC. Lovely to see you. That's where I teach, University of Illinois at Chicago. And so in 2015, we lost a colleague. Without saying too much about it, it was a suicide on a train track. So it was extremely dramatic, terrible event. And this is dedicated to that colleague. His name was Brian Higgins. The Social Fabric. However slivered, however occluded, however brindled the light you shined in your walks from building to building all these years, over sidewalks forking the city, or across the violet harbor of the suburbs, However vertigoed my own vantage point, or myopic my ability to see a lighthouse light its way through mist, I know that without you there, something's missing. Or lighthouse isn't perfect now for what I mean. None of us is a guiding light. We're more like an unseen planet's orb, meaningful only when connected as a chip within a larger galaxy. I mean chip as chipware, a table setting broken but still serving. Chips of shattered planet that emit a barely jangling light, a whirlpool of jagged streams, unthinkable necessity. And how to feel my way into a metaphor that reaches for exactly what I mean. Our orbits always swayed by even the most distant fragment in the pattern where I feel it beneath my forehead, just behind my eyes. This is why I needed you, even though it's true we almost never had occasion to speak. Because even the loneliest are never truly singular. I'll always need what I almost never see. Heading towards close to the end here. So this book did start out to be a book about media, and it still is, but a few things happened in my life over the course of writing these poems, and one of them was that my father died. And this poem called Death to America doesn't really mean death to America. Makes a few references that I want to mention. It starts in the first part of the Obama administration and then reaches backward to the 1976 presidential election. And so Jimmy Carter in that election was from Plains, Georgia. And the photographer, William Eggleston, went to Plains, Georgia, the hometown of Jimmy Carter, during the 1976 presidential election. And he did photographs of objects like salt shakers and, different things that were around in the town that had like nothing to do with the election really, but that were photographed during the time of the election. So it kind of makes reference to that. And there's also a line from W.B. Yeats in here as well, which you might recognize from Byzantium. This is the second to last poem I'm going to read in the reading. Death to America chant doesn't really mean death to America. Or so the screen told us, but a flag furl presently switch-bladed into flame on the television's wildfire diagonal plane, where an effigy rippled Obama's face, his smile too big like, 40 years ago, Carter's from Plains. The other day I saw William Eggleston's Plains photos, oak leaves and salt shakers, blue gingham tablecloths, sentinel things, unsnared by any rhetoric that floated jetsam flotsam in the 1976 presidential election. Eggleston liked the secret life of objects, but objects are coy. Did they listen to politics? Possibly, but all they heard were sentence sounds flurrying fast over Georgia. The truth was they didn't vote. The truth really is that I saw the TV in an oncologist's waiting room. I was sitting with the healthiest looking person in the place, who happened to be my father, who had come for his routine IVIG infusion, and who was, as it turned out, closer to death then than anyone could have guessed. The sicker people there might have died soon after, too, or maybe they worsened and against all odds recovered, put their clothes back on, learned to sit upright in wheelchairs, then retake their first gloried staggering steps. Yeah, you better believe that's glory, since my dad finally rode in an ambulance to hospice in his hospital gown, and he'd never wear his own clothes again. But on that other day, in waiting room oncology, when no one could have guessed who was the patient, him or me, and the flag was absorbed in its slow burn on TV, he began to look around him with concern and murmured, "People here look pretty bad, don't they?" My empathy was roused. I considered a patient in a surgical mask and bonnet. She was watching the fire with a certain kind of rapture. It reminded her of a book she'd read called Politics and Anger. Could she recall its contents? Where did anger reside in the populace that scattered over France before Vichy? Her mind was a kaleidoscope. It half filled with sky blue glass cut blossoming, then labored to crystallize the book covers painting. 3 men in striped suits juggling 3 balls. Prisoners, a sorry little smidgen of a dance, or dying into a dance, an agony of trance. I was trying to inhabit her, one image at a time, descending a ladder in the deep end of a pool, and I saw the pool was only growing deeper. And wondered, is this ethical? And then silently asked my father, can't you see that you're the exception? Don't you know you're going to live forever? And the last poem I'll read is called With a Song. There's something about music, the wish to be in the dark, like I don't know what person this voice must belong to. At times I love a secret which shears away from intellect, intrepid horn of birdsong when you won't see or know the bird. Or sometimes I'm riding in the car on I-80, dipping my eyes into the glamour of Ohio, its red barns or white barns severally unpainted by tactile fingers of winter weather. White barns with green roofs, sky blue with white roofs. Wait, isn't sky blue brighter than any sky you really see? Canned sky, you might reply. Hyperbole of color. Platinist Crayola blue. Would anyone trade a teal feather for a trill? The highway will line with mud and snow stripes along a fence, then apple orchard spider in the ice. A long strand of pines before the strip mall. And still from the radio, an alto, a tremble. I love not knowing who it belongs to. Thank you. So I guess we have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can ask your questions in the chat window, or you can unmute yourselves and ask the question. I allowed people to unmute at this point.
Or not, if the case may be, right? That's okay too.
I don't see the raise hands, and I'm going to ask one of those ridiculous questions that people sometimes ask poets. But first of all, I'd like to thank both of you. Beautiful poetry reading, lovely poetry. I am fascinated with it. So how did, I mean, I can understand the gentleman who unfortunately passed away and your father, but some of the other poems, how did you start with that sort of looking at media and technology and then taking it into different parts of life with such description? How did you get started on that path of writing poems in that vein? And what are you trying to say with the compendium of those poems as opposed to individual ones?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think the book started as a kind of sort of like where I was in my mood and what I was paying attention to. And, you know, thinking about, I've always, you know, had a fascination with writing about visual art and things like that. And just the idea of bringing in a little bit more, like extending that a little bit, and bringing in things like electronic media and television as well. But also feeling that I didn't want to be limited by that. I wanted to, in terms of media, I'm really thinking about, you know, made things, like the Greek word techne, you know, kind of making something as opposed to something being in nature. So the idea that these things can take various faces and various materials over history really fascinated me, and also just trying to kind of get a grip on what's happening now with media in our lives, and if you're a poet responding to various things. And so I guess that would be the second part of your question, is that all the poems in the book are working together because they're, again, exploring the different facets or the different sides. You know, there's some poems in the book that really are dealing with things like, you know, urns, or, you know, 19th century painting, or whatever, in part because I want to be open to all of this visual and sensory experience, and not do something that would crowd out other artistic expression, if that helps.
Yeah, no, I'll be fascinated if you pick up and start writing about artificial intelligence and singularity next, you know, you move on to the next layer.
The next thing,
yeah. And Jodie, you know, as you were reading the poems with horses, and forgive me for not having read your first book, horses symbolize so many things in poetry. I started thinking about Garcia Lorca and his poem, you know, green, green, how much I want you green, verde, verde, con te quiere verde. Because it gets into the horses galloping and has its own set of meanings that go with it. How did you get started using horses as that way of talking about the unspeakable?
It's so interesting. The short answer to your question is, I don't know. But what I will tell you is that recently I saw some real horses, and I was sort of like, oh my God, my horses are not real horses at all. Like, the horses that I'm writing about there's certainly something symbolic and some kind of archetype that I don't fully understand. Maybe I need to ask Freud about it or something. I don't know.
He's a bit passe these days.
Yeah,
One could still, go from him to Jung and then maybe on past that, but yeah.
But it's interesting because, in my first collection, the title poem was My Dark Horses, and those horses represented almost this sense of peace and Zen and just sort of acceptance. And sometimes they represent that, and sometimes they represent very different things. So they just sort of come to me as symbols. And I don't ride horses. I don't own horses. I don't even live near horses. And so, yeah, I don't know why I've had this sort of obsession with writing about them, but there is something, I think it's maybe the sort of otherworldly quality about them that seems to appeal to me.
Yeah, they are interesting, having lived with people who love horses of various and sundry different kinds. But anyway, thank you. Thank you.
Someone wrote in the chat box, Mona wrote in the chat box a question. Mona said, Jodie, I love the fantastical element of the poem you wrote about your sister's horses. I write like that a lot. Do you find it freeing? Mona, are you still here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what do you mean by freeing?
Well, hi, I write a lot of poetry.
Yeah.
And when I include fantastical elements in my poetry, I do find it kind of freeing to be able to let go and delve into the fantasy aspect of it. And I just wondered if you did too, because it's a little bit better to me to be able to let go like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. You sort of, when you use the surreal or the fantastical in that way, it's almost has like a fable like feeling to it. And I like to sort of step out of the ordinary world, and, it reminds me in a way of the books that I used to read as a kid, that it's just completely, it's almost an escapism for me.
Yes.
An escape from the ordinary.
Yes.
Very different from the kind of work that Christina's doing with confronting our media. I'm running away from it.
Well, I consider that a little bit fantastical too, though, the way you have the media with a personality. That's fantastical also. So yeah, both of them are. I really like that. I really appreciated this. Thank you both.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Oh, okay. Let's see. Catherine,
Can Chris share what new book themes are?
yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. Thanks, Catherine. Well, I have two books coming out in 2024. And one of them will feature one of Catherine's paintings on the cover. It's called Ghosts and the Overplus, and it's essays on reading poetry in the 21st century. So it's called Ghosts and the Overplus from University of Michigan Press. But the new book of poems called The Right Hand, coming out also in 24 with Tupelo Press, is well, it's about a few different things. It's dealing with elements of pain, body work, and wounding. And half of the book is focused on Bernini's sculpture of Saint Teresa in ecstasy, where Saint Teresa is being pierced by an arrow that's being carried by a little angel, which is in the Santa Maria della Vittoria church in Rome. So yeah, those are the themes of the next couple books. So thank you for that question.
Pat is asking, which comes first, the theme for the book or the poems?
Yeah, it's like the chicken or the egg. So in other words, do you start writing, and this is for both of you, I mean, do you have an idea for a whole series of things that you want to write about, and then you start working that out and as if you were writing chapters to a book? Or do the poems come and you realize, oh, I have 20 of these, so I'm going to fill that out and put it together, and they all follow a certain theme that I didn't realize I was even writing about? Which is it, chicken or the egg?
I was just having a discussion with a friend about this very question, because I think it's interesting. Different poets work in different ways. I definitely have the poems first, and then I'm combing through them looking, oh my gosh, do I have enough of a consistent theme for a book? If not, what do I need to do? So I very much have the poems first, and then am from there and am trying to sort of sculpt something out of it. I don't know how it works for you, Christina.
Yeah, I feel that, yeah, I mean, there's definitely an inductive thing that happens where, I mean, I would imagine nobody just, you know, kind of intellectually sits down and says, okay, now with nothing written, I'm going to do a big book on Saint Teresa being pierced by the angel or something. And so, yeah, there's definitely a kind of organic writing that happens. I do find it extremely helpful at a certain point in that writing to do that kind of work of being like, okay, what is this going to be? What is this turning into? And I'm saying this in part for some of my graduate students who are here, because sometimes people are like, why do I have to do a dissertation prospectus? They're doing a collection of poems, you know. And the amazing thing is, once you do that, once you actually sit down and figure it all out, for me at least, that's a huge impetus to finish. And so I do like to, at a certain point, to feel like, yeah, I can sit down and I can kind of conceptualize the whole thing, where it's going to go. And of course it may change, you know, over time, but I just find it, I was thinking about that too recently, how incredibly useful and incredibly valuable it is to have that stage, you know, of really having to kind of conceptualize the book. But Jodie's so right. It's like you can't do that without having written poems first, or at least some poems first.
I wish I could do more of the conceptual work, but as soon as I start sort of planning and organizing, then I almost sort of sabotage my own writing. As soon as I'm like, all right, this is going to have a nature theme to it, then suddenly I can't write any
Yeah.
about nature.
People are so different, really, about
Yeah.
it. Seriously, you know, it's like whatever works, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting that you would compare it to writing your dissertation, you know, having done one of those years ago as a history major. It's a very different thing from writing poetry.
Well, not for my graduate students, actually, because I teach in a PhD program in creative writing. And so they are writing what become books of poetry. And they actually are required to do a dissertation prospectus. So that's what they're doing. And not to sort of turn this into a graduate school like pep talk, but I do think that the, you know, sort of having to sit down and work it out is extremely useful to me as well as to them. Yeah.
So do the students start with already having some pieces written, and then they start?
Absolutely. Yes.
How are they going to craft this to turn it into a quote unquote thesis dissertation, which becomes a book of whatever.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Mhm.
Interesting.
Anyone else have any questions?
You know, I was fascinated with the image of hands. So if nobody else has a question, I'll pick that up later. But if they do, please ask another question. So Jodie, hands, you talk about your father through talking about music, but also his hands, which then becomes so poignant at the very end with the last holding of that hand, at least in that poem. However, it's in a second book. And the other poems which focus on him and his hands are in the first book. Do you think that that poem becomes informed by reading those first set of poems, and without reading them, it lacks something?
Actually, all the poems that I read today were all from Nocturne, which is my second book.
Okay.
Well, and I think the hands are, I mean, so my father is a genius musician, and the hands were the vehicle through which he was able to deliver his gift to the world. So it was, you know, he was always very protective of his hands, and they were more, you know, in the same way his Steinway piano was more important to him than anything, so were his hands. I remember as a little girl, I once put a glass of orange juice on his Steinway piano, and my father never got angry. That's when I learned, okay,
Oh my goodness.
you can't do this. So
Were his hands insured as well? Some musicians have insured their hands.
yeah, it's, you know, it's not a bad idea. So, you know, in the same way that it's not very romantic, but my laptop computer is where all my poems are. So if someone were to put a glass of orange juice on my laptop computer, I don't think I would appreciate it either.
Yeah, but they all end up in the cloud. Getting back to media and technology. So, well, thank you so much.
Oh.
All righty. So Zach, are you are we happy to sort of wrap this up?
It sounds good. I just want to thank everyone for coming out, and especially to the two of you, Jodie and Christina, for coming out and sharing your work. See if I still have the book links in there, so everyone's still here. Please get copies of the books if you're able, and that's the best way you can support our writers here today. So thank you all for coming out.